So this is one of my favorite topics as well, because it gets into some of the so-called new sciences of complexity or complex adaptive systems, as they're sometimes called. Jane Jacobs referred to organized complexity, and she really was one of the early people who first recognized this new emerging form of science or field of science, as we've talked about with Jacobs' work. But it's since then, this was 1961, of course, she was writing that book, and the field has really exploded, and many different aspects of complexity science and complex adaptive systems. And I'm going to cover some of those in this topic and how they might apply to cities and to buildings and to architecture and urban planning. And it really is about, especially about, I would say, the process of self-organization, the way that agents, distributed agents in the environment, in a system, can self-organize and can create powerful new forms of order, actually, that is very different from top-down forms of order, and in some ways complementary to top-down forms of order. We talk about the bottom-up, and then we talk about the top-down, and in a way that's really what we're referring to here when we refer to self-organization. And it turns out that that's enormously important in the built environment. Jacobs was famous for saying cities can provide something for everybody only when and only if they are created by everybody, in a sense, at least in some measure. And that is, again, this idea that we are all empowered, or should be empowered, if we're going to do the best job, to shape our environments, to act as agents, almost like termites or bees or social insects, creating the world that we live in, creating the structures that we live in, and the capacities that they have to solve our problems. If we're termites or bees or whatever, we're controlling the temperature, we're regulating the, creating safety, all the things that those settlements give us. And in fact, there's some really interesting and fun books. This is one that I think you would enjoy, called Emergence, by an author named Stephen Johnson. And the subtitle is The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities, and Software. And you might think on first glance, what the heck do ants and cities and brains and software have to do with one another? But he explores that topic, and it turns out there's a lot of relationship between those things. There is self-organization going on in all of those systems. There is emergence going on in all of those systems. I was talking earlier about how consciousness seems to be an emergent phenomenon that comes out of the structure of the brain and the relationship of the brain, and the neuron networks, the connectome, as it's called. And we recognize now that at its heart, although these patterns can be vastly complex and just astonishingly complex, the brain is one of the most complex structures we know. At its heart, the relationship between the neurons, for example, can be quite simple. And the relationship between many elements in a self-organizing process can be quite simple. And yet they can generate a pattern that can be quite complex. And that's an idea that is really at the heart of self-organization and at the heart of complex adaptive systems, actually. Very simple local adaptations that are made in an iterative cycle, in an algorithm, that result in complex patterns getting generated. And that's the idea of a cellular automaton. And I gave you an example of this little piece of software called Conway's Game of Life. And what it is, if you remember, is that it's a cellular automaton on the screen, on the computer screen, and I'm going to demonstrate it in just a moment, where it's just a simple set of two colors. It can be one color that's considered alive and another color that's considered dead. So a live cell with fewer than 2 live neighbors dies, quote unquote. In other words, it goes dark. A live cell with more than 3 live neighbors dies, as if by overcrowding. A live cell with 2 or 3 live neighbors lives unchanged to the next generation. And a dead cell, in other words, it's dark, with exactly 3 live neighbors, comes to life. So those are just 4 simple rules that you can program into the computer. You can make it look at the adjacent cells and decide whether to turn on or turn off, right? And just by doing that, and by doing it in a cycle, in an algorithm, you can generate these very complex patterns. And so let me jump to that and just show you what this looks like for a moment. We're going to jump over to the actual software here on the computer. And you can see the link I gave you earlier. Let's see, where's the share screen? There we go. Okay, so this one is called a Gosper glider. And the pattern that they've set up here generates a certain kind of movement that looks like gliders, looks like little creatures flying off away from it. Remember, this is just the 4 rules that I just described to you. If a neighbor is dead or dark, then you're dead. If a couple of neighbors are live, you go live. If more than a couple of neighbors are live, you go dead again, right? Well, here's what happens. Watch this. Boom, 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 away it goes. And it looks like it's coming to life, right? It looks like it's becoming an organism or little creatures flying off and doing interesting things. And these are self-organizing patterns. They're patterns that are only arising from the local interactions of the phenomena. Now look what else I can do. I can make my own little patterns. Let's see, let's do that, and let's do that. And let's do that over here and that. Now watch what happens. Now those are doing weird things. Look what my little pattern that I just made over here is doing all kinds of wild things. This is all emerging from the simple local rules and the interactions of those rules, creating emergent complex patterns that are they're predictable in a sense. They're predictable in the sense that it's simple rules that you could calculate out, but in practice, it's very, very difficult to actually predict what is going to happen way down the line. If you, for example, if I just put some patterns in here and I say, let's see what happens to these here. Let's watch this over here and see what it does. Look what it does. Oh, well, it just went, bloop, it completely disappeared. Now, if I do this, it sits there. Now, if I do this, it starts to move and go away. So it's fascinating what happens. And you get to a point with complex systems that it may not be possible to actually predict in a simpler way what the pattern is going to do. You could only run the pattern to see what it's going to do. That's called computational irreducibility. You cannot reduce the computations to a simpler formula. There are too many iterations, too many algorithms going on. It doesn't fit into anybody's neat computation. You have to actually run the system and see what it does over time, which is a really interesting limitation to our ability to predict and control. These systems can be computationally irreducible. You can't actually predict how it's going to behave overall. You can predict maybe in averages. Remember the sort of, Jane Jacobs was talking about the average behavior of statistical populations, but you can't predict precisely how these systems are going to behave. So that's a very interesting, I think, lesson about complexity and complex adaptive systems and how they behave. So getting back to the presentation here. So there are a number of people who have argued that this is really a new way of understanding the natural environment, understanding structure and how it behaves dynamically over time. Stephen Wolfram refers to it as a new kind of science based upon algorithms. It's not simply formulas, it's not simply equations, it's algorithms that sometimes can run and do things that we can't predict or control. And this happens in biological systems. It's what gives rise to many of the beautiful patterns of natural structures of animals and shells, mollusks, conch shells, and so on. It's what gives rise to fractal patterns, the sort of iterative cycles that work at different scales and create patterns. It's also what is responsible for the ways that molecular processes occur, that genetic processes occur as well, that they're interacting with each other in local ways and creating these emergent patterns, the emergent patterns of the genome that then go on to create the emergent patterns of the proteome. And as I said, the emergent patterns of the brain and the connectome and so on. Vastly, vastly complex and wonderful. Also, it's beautiful. It's exciting. It's awesome. It's literally awesome how the structure generates this complexity. And this is a very important new insight into the dynamics of the natural world. We can see it all around us if we look. For example, the way bird flocks behave. You've seen these incredibly complex patterns of how birds flocks sort of turn into these blobby things that move and twirl, but they're not chaotic. They're not just random. They actually have a shape to them and a form to them and a movement to them. And it turns out that the birds are also acting as cellular automata because they are following very simple rules. One of them is, follow the lead bird, whatever that bird is, but they're not all following that bird. They might be following some other bird that's following that bird, or some other bird that's following some other bird that's following some other bird. And they're using very simple rules to stay within a certain distance of the adjacent bird that they're near. So stay within 2 feet, but not 3 feet, or 1 meter, but not less than 1 meter, whatever, and vertically and horizontally and so on. And that gives rise to these complex patterns of the bird flock. So this is the core idea, that there are simple steps at the heart, and it produces vast complexity over time, and often vast beauty as well. And you can see that certainly in many biological systems where these simple algorithmic processes generate these really, really beautiful patterns, fractal patterns, symmetrical patterns. And a fractal is a form of symmetry, as we'll talk about later. And again, the patterns of the environments of the animals that they're creating for themselves, like bees and termites and so on, and the patterns of wings and coats and biological structures of various kinds that have these very complex and very beautiful patterns to them. Conch shells, as I mentioned, the spots of tigers, the rich patterning of birds, and so on. Those all come from the chemical interactions in algorithmic ways in the manners of self-organizing automata, the cellular automata interacting with each other. The cells are interacting with each other. The molecules are interacting with each other in just this kind of way and producing these wonderful patterns and the rich beauty of the world that we see all around us. Not only patterns, but structures, the fern leaf patterns, as I talked about in the other lecture, the patterns of the human face and the human body and other animals, spots of tigers and so on. Leaf patterns, the fractal patterns that they have, but also the sort of symmetries that they have. And of course, the fractal pattern of a leaf, you have the trunk of the tree, the branches of the tree, the twigs of the tree, the spine of the leaf, then the little finer offshoots, and then and so on. And again, you have the sort of tree-like, literally tree-like structure, the hierarchical structure, but you also have some interconnections going on in there, certainly at the capillary level, that sort of is nearly decomposable, not fully decomposable, as we talked about before. And many other patterns that are not even biological, they're just self-organizing patterns in the natural world, like the patterns of ridges in a seabed, for example, or the patterns of stain on the walls of a cliff, for example, that can be quite complex and quite rich and beautiful, quite fractal, in fact. So our understanding of fractal patterns is one of the key insights that has emerged from the science of complexity, if you will, or complex adaptive systems, and from the science of self-organization. And we understand now that the world is fractal, deeply fractal at many, many, many scales, and many examples of that all around us. And this is just a fractal pattern generated by a computer. I'm sure you've seen many of these, But at its heart, and of course you can see in the natural world too, the very rich fractal patterns of leaves and canyons and clouds and snowflakes and so on. But at its heart, a fractal pattern can be generated on a computer through a very, very simple algorithm. Remember, this is an incredibly complex pattern. There's some coloring and things that they've also done here, but at its heart, what's going on is this formula right here, Z in one. So what this is doing, I'm not going to go through the entire process to explain what the formula does, but essentially what it's doing is it's taking each pixel very much like a cellular automaton, and it's comparing that pixel to its neighbors. And then based upon what's going on with its neighbors, it changes the pixel. And then it does, and then it cycles again, and it does it for the next pixel and the next pixel and the next pixel, and it cycles through and it cycles through. It's an algorithm. It's a cellular automaton. And as the result of that cycling, you get this incredibly complex self-organizing pattern that we call a fractal. And you can spend a little more time digging into this if you're interested in it. There's a little bit of a description here. The point XY is colored according to the escape time of C. If a specified maximum number of iterations is reached, C is assumed to lie on or inside the Mandelbrot set and colored black. And this is how you either go black or white, but then you can also add colors. There's other things you can do to make these patterns richer and more complex. But essentially, this is what happens if you just do a black and white version. They've added the blue here to make it richer. You end up with this pattern, which is the sort of classic Mandelbrot set. And what you see is this is over and over and over again. It's the same pattern at different scales, different scales, different scales, different scales. That little sort of almost circular heart-shaped pattern gets reproduced there, and then it gets reproduced again there, and so on. So it's the same pattern is over and over and over again at infinite scales actually reproduced. And that's what a fractal is a piece that is a geometric fragment that is repeated at different scales. We would say it's a scaling symmetry or a symmetry at different scales. And this is how you get these really fantastic, rich patterns that you've seen in the natural world. And you've seen artists take these ideas and twist them and do interesting things with them, add color and so on. And this is what goes on in the natural world too, actually. This is how, cauliflowers, certain patterns of cauliflower, certain patterns of fern. I mentioned conch shells and many other patterns, and also patterns in traditional arts that are highly fractal. As I mentioned the other day, we now understand, and this was a book some years ago that looked at African traditional patterns and used the MAC, early version of the MAC, to analyze those and to show how they were highly fractal. As you can begin to see there, carpet designs and traditional building designs, cathedrals and so on. And also other kinds of patterns in the natural world, flowers and leaves and so on. And you can see when traditional people are making their crafts that they're often acting iteratively. They're acting as almost like following the rules of cellular automata. If I add a line here, I add the next line to it, and I generate something that goes like this. They're following essentially rules, generative rules that say, well, if you add this, then color in that. If you don't add this, then don't color in that. And you generate this complex pattern that's quite beautiful and quite organized in a very interesting way. Becomes more and more organized, more differentiated, more locally differentiated, and more locally complex. And you can see this in some of the architectures today. Calatrava's work, for example, is highly fractal, and also some of the traditional architecture that's highly fractal in African geometries, for example, of buildings, and many other geometries as well. And so I think Wolfram has a point that this is a new kind of science, or certainly a new layer on top of the sciences that we had previously. that help us to understand the kinds of geometries that we see in the world around us and the ways that they behave, the ways that they are able to behave. For example, chemical processes and genetic processes and the processes of the brain and so on. This is opening up many new avenues of inquiry for us to understand in things like neuroscience, which we're going to talk about later in the course, and other fields, beginning to understand how we experience the world and why we experience it in particular ways, and why some of those ways are conducive to our health and our well-being. Going back to the great Herbert Simon again, in around the time of Jacobs and Alexander, another figure like them who was trying to tease out some of the structures of the world that we were missing at that time, and he made it something really a very interesting insight in The Architecture of Complexity, that paper that I mentioned before, that a person viewed as a behaving system is quite simple. The apparent complexity of their behavior over time is largely a reflection of the complexity of the environment in which they find themselves. They're essentially cellular automata that are reacting to the complexity of the environment. And furthermore, they are changing that environment and making it more complex, right, as you interact with the world. But the actual behaving system is quite simple. I'm going to go look for food. I'm going to go find some work to do to, earn a living, earn some money. I'm going to exchange that money. I'm going to follow rules, etc. Those are the simple rules of the algorithm that we all, as independent agents, follow during the course of a day. And then, of course, we generate this vast complexity of the world that we're in, and we interact with that complexity as we go. By the way, this is a model of disease transmission. Actually, this was from before COVID, but what it was showing is that people interacting with each other transmit the virus in certain kinds of progressions. You can see incubation, infection, and the person is removed because they got sick or they went home or whatever. So again, it's a cellular automaton process where it's fairly simple rules of if I'm within, let's say, a meter of one other person, I'm much more likely to infect them. If I'm further away than a meter, I'm probably not going to infect them. If I'm outdoors, I'm probably not going to infect them. Simple rules that generate the vast complexity of the patterns of COVID transmission, for example. And that is something that we need to understand and that we need to be able to model to a certain degree. Again, we've got the problem of computational irreducibility, but we do need to be able to at least understand the core model and understand the basic dynamics. What are the rules? Is it 1 meter that we get infected? Is it 3 meters? We need to, this isn't a kind of science that tells us that we can't understand the world. It simply tells us how we can and can't understand the world. And that in itself is incredibly useful, incredibly important. And again, as I said, this is what goes on in biological processes that is very, very important now in understanding how genetic processes are actually working, helping us to tease out what's actually going on in biological processes and in ecological processes as well, how different ecological systems behave as essentially cellular automata, as individuals within a species, and also different species interact with each other in this rule-like behavior. If I'm a predator and I don't have if the creature that I eat as a predator has suddenly become extinct because the creature down the next rung of the ladder has become extinct, then what am I going to eat? I'm now going to become extinct, right? So the cellular automata interact with each other at that scale as well, at the scale of biological systems and ecological systems. And this is very, very important for us to be able to understand how, for example, the destruction of rainforests is not simply a matter of, well, I've lost X number of species, and now I have Y number left. No, we need to understand the interactive patterns, the emergent patterns of biological processes in order to understand where there are perhaps critical relationships that that have far more consequences than we might think. Remember, with the Conway's game of life, if I put a certain dot somewhere, it can propagate out and have all these amazing effects. You know, I wouldn't necessarily know that unless I knew that be careful not to hit that dot. And in ecological systems, the same thing is true. If I'm not aware that losing a particular species, known as a keystone species, for example, is going to trigger all kinds of other species extinctions or species, disease processes or other phenomena that I'm as a conservator and as a person who might rely upon that ecosystem for my food. I'm going to want to know that. I'm going to want to try to understand that and manage that in order to conserve a resource on which I might depend as a human being. And maybe just I want to, and this is the other point about ecological systems, by the way, is you might want to conserve it just because it's beautiful and because you don't want to lose a beautiful structure in the natural world. But you might also not know that that is one of those pixels in the Conway game of life that is going to propagate out and cause all kinds of other problems, like loss of fisheries or loss of soil or loss of the ability to do agriculture for some reason. Pollination of bees, for example. You've heard about colony collapse and the potential loss of bee populations and insect pollinators that are needed for agriculture, that render an ecosystem service, as it's called. So there are many implications of this understanding of the natural world that directly inform us as human beings who are interested in our own resources and in making sure that we have enough resources and that we don't run into huge problems ourselves as a species. Because again, we see that all these things are interconnected, and we see that there are these phenomena that can propagate out and create much larger problems or much larger impacts. And that is also known as a tipping point. You probably heard that phrase. The tipping point is when a phenomenon reaches a certain level of impact and it suddenly creates a much larger impact. And you saw in the Conway game of life where if I just made a couple of little black dots and then suddenly the whole thing propagated out, and then it becomes this huge thing that suddenly, turns a much larger area black. That's a tipping point, and that happens all the time in these kinds of iterative processes. And we're understanding now, I think, that our technologies are as complex as they are, as complex as a jumbo jet is or a supercomputer is. They pale in comparison to the complexity of biological systems and certainly the biological system of the brain. And why is that? Well, a fundamental reason is that the biological systems are tapping into the power of self-organization, the power of complex adaptive systems. And this is something that we're trying now to integrate into our technological systems. And it's very, very important that we do that. This is really what AI is, for example, is trying to tap into the self-organization of algorithms in the computer process, right? Of actually trying to exploit the dynamics of self-organization and of learning, in a sense. Self-organization is, in a sense, a kind of learning. It's a kind of adaptive and emergent process that allows us to successfully adapt to a given situation, a given problem, a given issue that we need to learn about, whatever it is. And that's what we're now beginning to try desperately to do in our technologies, trying to exploit this enormous power. And to exploit this enormous power and understanding our ecosystems and how complex they actually are. And I mentioned rainforest, but we can also think about river deltas and the very complex estuary systems that exist all around the world, where the the freshwater systems interact with the ocean systems, and it becomes a very complex filtering process that turns out to be very important for the health of oceans, and in removing toxins and so on. And what we've done, unfortunately, in the 20th century is we've dumbed it down. We've been very naive in thinking that we could just rationalize and simplify and remove the messiness from the natural world. And we didn't understand. We were like children, stumbling in and causing a lot of damage. That the messiness is actually not messy. It's order. It's a different kind of order that's more complex. It's an emergent order that has occurred over a long period of time. So, for example, the meanders of rivers, if we say, oh, well, that's just inefficient, why does that river move over like that? Why don't we just cut a channel through there and rationalize and make the river straight? We've done that a lot. We've created these channels all over all over the world. This is the Mississippi Delta, by the way, near New Orleans, Louisiana. And this is the Mississippi River. And what you can see underneath the pattern there is a very complex pattern that is self-organized and shifted and reorganized over time, responding to different conditions of the terrain moving around and sort of chaotic processes and so on. And some of this is what we would consider chaos or turbulence. And that's just another way of saying it's so complex that we don't readily understand why it's doing what it's doing. It's computationally irreducible, right? And we call that chaos. But the idea that we're going to just rationalize it and simplify it and cut straight through, make it more quote unquote efficient, is really a very stupid idea, it turns out. Because here's what happens. This is what we've done to the Mississippi Delta. We've cut all of these straight channels through it, and through the river. You can sort of see some of them there. And this is what happened after I believe this is the 2005 Katrina hurricane that came through. Watch what happens to all these complex tissues of. Remember, this is filtering the water. This is doing important things for human beings and for the fisheries and for the health of the ecosystem and so on. And this is what ended up happening as we cut it off. It wiped out a huge, huge percentage of this critical resource, this mangrove forest, this filtration system that is not only filtering the water, but it's also absorbing enormous amounts of energy from the hurricanes that come into Louisiana and into many parts of the world, typhoons and so on, other storms of various kinds, flooding and so on. And this is as a result of this practice of cutting these channels through a critical natural system, a complex natural system of this kind, we directly certainly increased the damage enormously from Hurricane Katrina, and just about wiped out one of our major cities in 2005. Now magnify that times however many, when you look at the increasing number of hurricanes around the world and increasing vulnerability of so many parts of the world, in even more than in Louisiana. If you look at Bangladesh, for example, and many other places that are very, very vulnerable, these impacts have been, human impacts have been very, very damaging to our resilience. And of course, then the impact of greenhouse gas emissions itself is increasing the damage from these storms as well. So it's a double whammy or a triple whammy, really, from multiple forms of damage that we have created. But on the other hand, you can see human constructions that are quite adaptive and quite complex. These are rice paddies in Asia, and you can see how carefully constructed they are and how they're quite resilient, actually, because the farmers are constantly repairing them and reconstructing them and opening up a little channel to feed the next the next rice paddy and so on, and then building it back up again if it gets damaged, and creating a very complex adaptive system, almost like bees or termites or other social insects, self-organizing this pattern and maintaining it and keeping it complex. But we think of this in the modern era as primitive. This is a primitive way to build, to conduct agriculture. How stupid these people are to build these systems. Well, not so fast. There's something going on here that we, in our simplistic thinking and our naivete and our failure to understand what's actually going on, are missing. We're missing the power of this self-organization, of this process that human beings have been doing for a long time, have been tapping into for a long time. And the beauty of it, of course, there's wonderful photography of some of these rice paddies and how spectacular they are. But again, it's not just how beautiful they are, because that's, I think, a consequence of their deeper order, that we can perceive that and we find it pleasurable, but also how orderly they are, how resilient they can be, how human beings can interact with these systems in very complex, rich ways. And so I think this is a lesson that we're taking away now from our understanding of how these processes actually work, and of how our technologies today need to be improved, need to be enriched with insights from these sciences and from these this understanding of structure and structural dynamics. A related topic is something known as an attractor. And I'm going to describe the work of René Thom, who was a French mathematician and philosopher, very important in the world of complexity and of what's known as chaos, and the world of, he's famous for talking about attractors and strange attractors and morphodynamic fields, as he referred to it. Or what I would call morphodynamic structuralism, and I'll describe what that means. So again, think about the cellular automata and the way that they're interacting with each other. What they're doing is they're creating a field pattern that has a particular form, right? And this is a very simple example of that. This is a simple chemical reaction known as the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. And you can see it happening. It's quite amazing and wonderful. And it's just a chemical process that is creating these amazing, beautiful patterns. And so what Tom was pointing out is that there's a field effect that occurs that can be quite striking, quite orderly in a way. These sort of bullseye patterns, for example, in this process, that again is just the result of the interactions of the agents, of the individual molecules in this case. But it's also occurs in a particular consistent way over and over and over again. And he referred to those consistent patterns as attractors or attractor basins. And he, as a mathematician, what's beautiful about his work is that he described those in equations. He was able to actually describe how attractors work as structural phenomena in mathematical terms. And you can see other examples of this kind of process going on. Slime mold, for example, this is really amazing, that amoebas that normally are just individual cells and they're off doing their thing, looking for food and so on. If they get particularly hungry, they will merge into what is known as a slime mold pattern that begins to move and begins to actually seek food. And it will do things like move around an obstacle. You can see over on the right there that the slime mold is broken up into two parts and is moving around that tree trunk. Quite fantastic. Now, remember, those are individual amoebas that are behaving like one big organism. And of course, in a biological sense, that's what all organisms are, right? They're individual cells that are acting like one organism, because that's what they are. They've become united into a multicellular organism. And this is what's going on as a natural phenomenon, as a natural form of self-organization of the amoebas. They're all sort of chemically interacting with one another and sending each other patterns of, hey, come stick by me, buddy. We're hungry now, so let's start behaving in this rule-like way. Let's start behaving like cellular automata. And lo and behold, you can describe how those cellular automata are going to behave if they're slime molds or if they're other kinds of structures. Remember, it's not always computationally irreducible. It's not always what we would call chaotic. The beauty of Rene Tom's work is that he showed that there is a relationship between the chaos and the order, the chaos and the attractors, if you will. And he's been fantastic in describing that. And we can see these morphodynamic fields all over in the natural world and in the physical world, and how these structures interact and generate patterns in relationship to one another. I talked earlier about how we see these fractal patterns that are generated, but they get generated in a certain kind of pattern that we can predict. And this is the important thing about a morphodynamic field, that we can predict where the structures are going to form. So now we have a predictive tool. We can begin to describe how complexity is going to emerge and how it's going to behave in consistent ways. The great biologist Brian Goodwin and Ricard Soleil, his colleague, have written about this extensively. Beautiful work of theirs and beautiful descriptions of how complexity and complexity of emergence actually operates in the natural world, how order emerges. Stuart Kaufman, wonderful book, At Home in the Universe, the laws of self-organization and complexity that help us to understand what it is that we humans are as creatures, ultimately, how we have emerged in a way, and yet there's a great order to it. There's a great overarching coherence to it that is in a way divine, you might say, inspirational. And so this is not an anti-theological way of understanding the world or an anti-spiritual way of understanding the world. In fact, it's another way of understanding the order of the universe, or what Einstein referred to as Spinoza's God, who seeks the harmony of the laws of the universe. And so this is a really fascinating and I think profound way of understanding not only biological systems and not only human systems, human environments, but complex systems the world over, the universe over. I mentioned insects, and this is the way termites behave and create structures that they are able to communicate with one another by laying down chemical signals. And the chemical signals allow them to build up patterns in the physical world. This is known as stigmergy, S-T-I-G-M-E-R-G-Y, stigmergy. And we can see stigmergic patterns going on all the time in the world, the way army ants form patterns. And for example, when they're going on a raid and they lay down chemical signals of the path that they're going to follow for the other ants behind them to follow in that swarming raid pattern. This is the way cities emerge ultimately. You don't build a shop unless the people are there. And then once you have that shop, maybe more people come. And then another person comes and puts in another shop and more people come. And then another person puts in another shop and more people come. So you're laying down a signal, a chemical control signal, if you will, of saying, hey, there's retail here. There's commerce here, and other people will come along and see that signal, see that there's retail there, and will build another shop, and it'll grow, it'll become more, and this is the way that villages turn into towns and towns turn into cities, and small shops turn into big shops and small businesses turn into big businesses, and so on. It's a stigmergic process. It's a process of building things in the physical world that other human beings can see and begin to respond to and behave and interact in that pattern. And I think this is one of the cities in the UK. I can't remember which one it is. At any rate, And also you can see, by the way, how they're following rules. Remember the cellular automata that are following rules. And these guys are following rules, interacting with each other. And maybe now, if they are able to get into automobiles and they're able to drive long distances, then suddenly there are new rules, right? There are rules that say, oh, you can now drive for 30 minutes and you can go shop in a little out of the way place much farther out. And the next person will say, oh, I'm going to drive 30 minutes and shop there as well. So suddenly you're getting these new patterns, these new ex-urban, out-of-town shopping patterns, and you're getting sprawl. So sprawl is a form of self-organization. We might say it's a pathological form of self-organization, or one that has impacts that we don't want to see. We want to control those impacts in some way, like greenhouse gas emissions, for example. But it is following rule-based patterns. I referred to the operating system for growth, right? And settlements throughout history have formed in this way of individual agents interacting with one another and generating structures in the world. And then other individuals react to those structures and transform them and change them. You remember we were talking about the way different agents, this is the work of Mustafa bin Hamouche, the landowner on the upper left, decides to sell his land into parcels, and then he decides, the different parcel owners decide, well, you know what, we're going to create we're going to agree in the lower right that we're going to create new passageways so that our land becomes more valuable, so that now we can have a shop on that new passageway, that new street. So they're constantly self-organizing and differentiating and forming new structures, interacting with one another as distributed agents, and so on. And I think if you're interested in this topic, one of the authors that I think you really ought to explore is my friend Basim Hakim, who has written some wonderful work on this. For example, this paper in Urban Design International called Mediterranean Urban and Building Codes, Origin, Content, Impact, and Lessons. And he's looking at Byzantine and Islamic civilizations of the Near East. And he's looking at how the codes function as algorithmic rules, as the rules of the cellular automata, and how they behave as distributed agents, right? And he's talking about how emergent systems depend on living within boundaries defined by rules. The system's capacity for learning, growth, and experimentation derives from its adherence to these rules, and the network pattern, networks of communication, feedback loops, all the things that we're talking about, right? In other systems. He's talking about it in urban systems and in architectural systems. And that the underlying generative system and its codes is similar to the way an embryo develops. And he describes the work by Lewis Wolpert, the generative program that generates an embryo, very similar for a generative system. It does not contain a description of the animal, rather it contains a generative program, a kind of recipe. Remember, we were talking about that, or a kind of process, a procedure. And out of that process, the form emerges. There's no master builder, that should be master builder, not matter builder, in the embryo. Each cell has the same information. They're following these generative rules, the self-organizing and self-governing regions. And this is what he says occurs in a typical traditional built environment, that the phenomenon of emergence was going on, and we're now recognizing that that's what's going on in these complex settlements that occur all over the world in traditional settlements, and in modern settlements too, by the way, in ways that we don't necessarily recognize. Certainly the way markets behave is often self-organizing according to the rules of cellular automata, and other processes that we sometimes don't understand and we don't empower in the right ways. We sort of fail to tap into that kind of power. So early on, I talked about the difference between top-down and bottom-up, and that's sort of a simplification in the ways that we think about that. But let's think about what that might mean. If you think about template-based reproduction and recombination, this is the idea, the parts making the wholes, right? You're building a Lego set and all the Lego blocks are the same, and you're putting them together into different forms and, you know, making them look certain ways that you want them to look because you're the master builder. You're doing it top down, right? You're creating mechanical constructions out of parts, assembling them into compositions, right? But this is another kind of order that Basim Hakim and Rene Tom and others are describing, which is stepwise iteration and differentiation, or what we would call growth. Now, both of those occur all the time. If you think about the top down, where you're sort of cutting and carving and specifying, right? Or bottom up, where you're generating and you know, the cellular automata are jostling near each other and following rules for spacing and so on. And you'll see in natural systems where those two processes are going on together. For example, the river itself is maybe cutting multiple channels and creating this island in the middle, and then the trees are popping up on the island, the top down and the bottom up. The river cutting the channels and the trees popping up, bottom up, literally bottom up. And so going back to one of our earlier lectures when we talked about the difference between a perfect hierarchy, not a nearly decomposable hierarchy, but a perfect hierarchy, and a perfect web network where everything is interconnected with everything else, what you really have in most cases is some kind of a hybrid of that, right? You have a nearly decomposable hierarchy or a combination of top down and bottom up. And you see that all the time in the natural world and in cities as well. But what we see in cities today is, if you will, an over-reliance on the segregation and the top-down and the fragmentation, as we've talked about earlier. And that is, I think, a direct result of relying too much on, you know, this form of order that I talked about before, this form of template-based order, right, of creating the components out of identical elements, the standardization and the scale of all of those places. You make 1 million of the Lego blocks and you standardize all of the Lego blocks. You maybe make a couple of different colors. And those are economies of scale and standardization. And that's what we've tapped into across the world today. And that's the world that we've built in many ways. The problem of large numbers, as Gideon said, and as Andres Duani has sort of reframed it a little bit. The idea of mechanization, of segregation, of you know, creating automobiles that are all more or less the same. There's maybe some differentiation of models, but all of the parts are the same. All the elements are the same. They're mostly, you know, standardized. The factories are standardized, or have been up until recently. And then there's the economies of place and differentiation, the idea of localization, diversification, adaptation. This is the idea that these are ecological systems. This is how ecological systems work. And the robustness of those systems, the resilience of those systems depends upon their diversity and their localization and their ability to adapt to problems as they crop up as distributed agents. And as he says, specialization at the expense of diversity is unwholesome for both economies and ecosystems. If there are too many of one thing, if you have a monoculture and suddenly you have one bug that particular plant is vulnerable to, now you're going to wipe out the entire monoculture and you're going to be in big trouble. The same thing is true in the built environment, she points out. And this is, so I'm going to close now by talking a little bit about the reading assignment that I gave you. And this was a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago in City Lab, the blog City Lab. And it was called, as you remember, it's 5 key takeaways from the new science of cities. So what I was doing there, and what I'll do now to sort of summarize this talk, is give you sort of 5 key points that apply to cities from this new understanding of the natural world, of the structure of the natural world, of the physical nature of the natural world, the dynamics of the natural world, and the built world as it is optimally organized. So talking about the new science that's emerging, the cutting edge hubs and so on, and contradicting a lot of um, today's orthodoxy when it comes to urban systems, going back to Jane Jacobs and so on. And I love the illustration they made for me, which was a bunch of little Jane Jacobses in lab coats, if you remember. And it is very much feeding into the Habitat 3 conference and the new urban agenda, as we've been talking about all along, and arming us with new ammunition in the global battle against sprawl and the global battle against many of the other problems that we're seeing in the built environment, the failures to meet human need that we're seeing, and the problems that we're facing. In one sense, these lessons are not so new. I went back to Jacobs and talked about that. Jeff West at the Santa Fe Institute liked to say that they're just doing Jacobs with the math there. I love that expression. And today we're applying a lot of those insights. This is a very dynamic field. There's a lot going on already. My friend Luis Betancourt over at University of Chicago, who was at Santa Fe Institute, taking this forward. Many other people, Mike Batty at University College London, my friend Nikos Salingaros, who's done a lot of work in this area, and so on. And so there are a lot of people that are mining the insights of complexity science and applying it to cities and architecture buildings. So let me run through some of the key takeaways that I described in this reading assignment, and then we'll have hopefully a little bit of time for discussion. So one of the lessons is economic development, economic growth, the idea of economic spillovers that results from the adjacencies that happen in cities, not the formal adjacencies, the strong ties of people that we already know, like our family members and the people that we already are working with, but the new people that we encounter in cities, the random encounters, the propinquity and serendipity, as they say, the closeness and the accidental interaction, which happens often in public spaces and in the adjacent third spaces, where we encounter and interact with people and form the weak ties. And this is where a lot of research is bearing this out. This is, I think I mentioned this paper before by Maria P. Roche, Taking Innovation to the Streets, looking at this microgeography of spillovers, of economic spillovers that occur within the public realm, within the streets and public spaces and the adjoining third places and so on, which ultimately is what connects us all in the city, right, as we've talked about. And so this is a very, very important economic capacity of cities. It's maybe why we build cities at all, or one of the key reasons that we build cities at all, to create these networks of proximity, casual encounter, and economic spillover. So that's one takeaway. Another one is that cities generate a remarkably large green dividend, a great efficiency, not only because, as I described earlier, we're closer together because we're denser, but also because we have this mix, this diversity, this capacity for self-organization. And that creates enormous efficiency, as we see in biological systems. It's not just the density, it's not just the fact that we have more efficient transportation, it's a network dynamic, kind of like the network dynamic of metabolic systems. And you can think of a corollary between for example, what I referred to as economic spillovers. They're sometimes called Jacobs spillovers now in honor of Jane Jacobs. And we could describe a very similar thing called a resource spillover. In other words, a metabolic efficiency. It sort of takes a shortcut in the network to become more efficient, and it can self-organize and do that within that kind of pattern. And this is an exciting insight about why cities are greener than other places. I wrote another piece on just that topic in City Lab that you can read if you'd like to. But that's the essential insight, is that interconnected network structure allows that capacity, allows that self-organization and that greater efficiency, which is a very hopeful thing when you're looking at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, and reducing other kinds of impacts, other kinds of depletion, and transitioning from an economy of scale and standardization to an economy of place and differentiation, because again, we can become more efficient. We can become more essentially ecological in our approach to things. And that's very important as well. Another insight is that cities perform best economically and environmentally when they feature pervasive human scale connectivity. Again, this is the network insight, the idea that if we're interconnected into a web network, we are able to self-organize, we're able to act as automata in a more complex pattern, a more efficient pattern, a pattern that is able to pursue our goals more effectively in a distributed way and in a self-organizing way. This is the great power of self-organization, that it requires this interconnection, though, if it's going to work properly. Jacob said, you know, we need to understand that this occurs right down to the scale of the lowly sidewalk, you know, the human scale, where we are face to face with one another in the public realm. And these are the small change by which the wealth of a city grows. And this is certainly what we're seeing when we look at the interconnected patterns of great cities like London. This is a space syntax analysis of the complex street patterns of London. And you can see the pervasive connectivity all across that complex fabric, really, that tissue of, in this case, streets and paths and squares and so on, going right across the river and right across other barriers. There are no border vacuums, almost none. You get into some over here on the right, right? This is, I think, the Thames, this is the Greenwich area, and it's starting to fall apart a little bit there with these giant modernist structures and so on. So this is an important insight about the structure of cities. Another insight is that cities perform best when they adapt to human psychological dynamics and patterns of activity. Remember, these are cellular automata that are behaving at the scale of the human being. We're interacting with each other. We're seeing each other. We're seeing our environment. We're seeing the stigmergy, the patterns that we're laying down in front of one another in the built environment, and creating the opportunity for other people to come along and add to that pattern or make it more complex or differentiate it or enrich it. Remember that place network on the London street and how over 5 years it changed and so on. And you remember how people are interacting with each other in public spaces and need to be able to see one another, need to be able to have edges to the public space. This is some of the work of the great William H. White, looking at the social life of small urban spaces and how there's lots of complex things going on in those spaces, and we need to pay attention to that. And that we need to distribute the control to the agents, right? Distributed agents need to have distributed control to some degree. Remember what I was talking earlier about the great work of anyway, so we need to make sure that people have that distributed control of spatial structure, that residents have that control. We need varying degrees of public and private space. We need to control the variations at different times of the day and over the span of our lives. You know, at different periods of our lives, we're more interested in other things, more interested in how, for example, if we're young people, we might want to be right in the middle of the action. If we have families, we might need to have more privacy, more private outdoor space. Perhaps if we're seniors, we might want to be back in the thick of things again to some degree, but maybe still able to be safe and so on and protected. And we need to be able to do things like open doors and close windows and draw blinds, come out onto porches, colonize public spaces, retreat into the privacy of our homes when we need to, and be able to remodel our homes and remodel our businesses, build new buildings, build new businesses, be part of the agent-based self-organizing of a great city, like we saw, for example, in the example of Venice I showed you earlier, or in the ways that we can actually control at smaller scales our own environment and become comfortable there. You remember what John Houbraken was saying about how important it is to distribute control to the agents. And that is so important if we're going to be able to overcome some of the limitations of the ways that we're doing things today. And so, as I concluded in the article, we can see that cities are, in fact, complex adaptive systems. They have their own characteristic dynamics, and we need to deal with them in that way if we're going to see them perform well from a human point of view, to meet our needs and to overcome our challenges and so on. And that means that we have to reassess our current systems of planning, building, and managing all of the laws, the codes, standards, models, incentives, and disincentives, all of these elements of the operating system for growth, as I've referred to it before. And we need to understand these dynamics and put them to work for us, put self-organization to work for us. And really, in order to do that, we need to take an evidence-based approach. I'm going to talk more about evidence-based design later on in the course, but draw from the best lessons of science and from history, from human history and the natural world, about the making of good cities from a human point of view. So I've given you, once again, a lot to unpack. I know we have maybe another 15 minutes or so to reflect on that. And I wonder, Mohsen, if you wanted to comment, if there are any particular questions or topics that you found especially interesting or challenging or worth remarking about.
Thank you for your time, Professor. The question that feeds my mind is, because I'm working on the let's say roles and effects of water in the urban morphology, and I want to ask how it can change the pattern of a city.
Mm-hmm. Well,
water bodies, I mean.
So your work on water, you're looking at essentially hydrology and water systems. Is that the idea that you're?
No, actually it's seeing the water as an agent for regeneration. In urban sites.
Well, I think, what we see is that there are many different scales and many different subsystems that come together in a city and that interact in particular ways. And I'm going to talk more about morphodynamic fields and attractors and attractor basins, because I think that's a key insight that we can develop in interesting ways when we're talking about how to do design work, design for self-organization. I hope that's a theme that emerges in your thinking about this course and in thinking about the new urban agenda and what it's really advocating. It's really advocating that we empower people as self-organizing agents, whether it's upgrading slums or empowering people to find opportunities, start small businesses, for example, build shops, build vending opportunities and so on. One of the things we'll talk about later is the idea that you need the rungs of the ladder, so to speak, for people to be able to pursue opportunities in the city. And so this idea that we need to create or we need to really curate, almost like gardeners, right? Foster the growth of different kinds of human development at different scales and different kinds of ecological development at different scales, and to be able to accommodate that and empower that through our design. And this is really the idea of design for self-organization, that we're by definition we're operating top down, because we are the agents that are coming in and as planners or as designers or as architects or as government officials of one kind or another, or whatever role we're playing, institutional players of one kind or another. But we're also acting as agents within a network. And this is, again, I referred to polycentric cities, and Elinor Ostrom was famous, the economist, was famous for describing polycentric governance, that institutions are in a network. Bruno Latour, also the actor network theory, the idea that actors can be institutions, they can be levels of government, they can be designers, they can be builders, they can be business owners, they can be the buildings, they can be the structures in the environment that are interacting in this network structure in a particular way. And if we understand that, we can empower that, and we can create more capacity for the kinds of things to happen that we want to have happen, like those who are in poverty having more opportunities to get out of poverty, to perhaps also get access to resources that they need, access to healthcare, access to shelter, access to opportunities of various kinds for human development. So I think if we understand that the city is a kind of morphodynamic field, to use that term, that allows the agents to interact. It has created the stigmergic patterns, the stigmergy patterns in the environment, and we ourselves are helping to create those and helping to create the connections through the patterns that we are creating as designers. The more interconnected patterns, avoiding the border vacuums, avoiding the fragmentation, and avoiding the sprawl, avoiding the over dependence of one kind of system, and making sure that we have diversity, whether it's avoiding the dependence on the automobile, and making sure that we have a diversity of ways of getting around, walking, biking, other modes, public transportation, and so on, or other kinds of population, people, young people, old people, poor people, wealthy people, diversity. Diversity is good for cities in general. That was Jacob's great insight. And a lack of diversity is the fundamental problem that occurs in cities. And we'll talk about that a little later too, how that can happen, and how we can create the self-destruction of diversity if we're not careful. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question or helps to give you a way of thinking about it, but does that what else are you thinking about at this point, Mohsen?
I think I need more literature review, and actually the problem here is that this subject is really extensive. It's like extended in every discipline, so it's hard to fix it in a certain way, and no one can answer it directly because there's not a direct question here.
Yeah, well, the structure of this course follows the theme that I have tried to get across to you, which is the idea of a web network, of an interconnection of multiple elements. And part of the problem with our approach to cities is that we're trying to reduce them to these simple tree-like structures, and cities aren't like that. And I've tried to mirror that in the structure of the course and say, this is not a simple A equals B equals C kind of structure, that this is a web network of topics that are interrelated with one another. Now, I know that that's a mind-blowing thing, and that you come into it thinking, oh my God, how can I make sense of this, right? But actually, that's what human beings do all the time. That's how we learn language. Babies come into being able to learn a language with it all being a network, a self-organizing pile of nonsense at first, right? And gradually they begin to tease out, oh, I see, this is connected to this, and oh, I'm going to use this word and I'm going to use that word. And they gradually, in their own minds, build up a network of understanding. And that's what I'm hoping that you'll be able to do. But I know, of course, that this is a a long road, a slow process, and that you're not going to get it the first time, which is part of the reason that I've also recorded these lectures and made them available to you for review. And I know also that you will need to go back and look at some of the readings that I referred to, and also make it your own. You know, find things that you find interesting in this topic and that are more directly related to your own area of research and that you want to tease out. You may have seen, for example, that Dominic in his paper teased out the connection to Aristotle and his own interest in Aristotle's work and Nicomachean ethics and other things that he's studied. So I would encourage you to do that, to, you know, follow your own thread and sort of like a baby learning a particular word and a particular set of words, and, you know, you repeat that and you sort of play with that and you get it in your mind and you sort of work it in your mind, and that's a good way to, I think, find what's relevant to you. And I don't expect that you know, all of you or anybody taking this course or other courses like it to just come away knowing everything about it, you know, or knowing grasping every aspect of it, because it's too dense. It's too many topics. And I myself find it fascinating. Every time I give a lecture, I see new connections and I see new revelations and new insights. And that's what I love about it, actually. And that's what I love about cities. And what I love about, you know, all of these topics that we're pursuing is that I was talking to Dominic about this earlier when we first came on, about how you know, you're finding new things all the time, making new connections that nobody's made before. Certainly, maybe you haven't made before. And when you're finding new connections that nobody has made before, that's science. That's where you're making new knowledge, and you're maybe creating something that's going to be very useful potentially. You don't necessarily know. Maybe it's not that useful, but it's you'd start out by finding something that's interesting, and then you figure out whether it's going to be useful. And over time, as you're doing your research, you can develop that into a very sort of robust, distilled down set of findings, set of ideas, set of, you know, that's your thesis, right? That's your dissertation. Once you've gotten that, and it involves new knowledge, it involves new connections that you've made, new contributions to the literature, which is what you have to do when you're doing a PhD, because it's all about creating new knowledge, new publication-worthy knowledge. Even doing a journal paper, a publication, needs to be publication-worthy new knowledge, new connection, new ideas, new findings that are relevant, however narrow they might be, but they're relevant to the, you know, the pursuit that the journal readers are interested in. So Dominic, I've talked on for a little too long here, but giving you another 5 or 6 minutes to reflect. What are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much. During the lecture today, you have presented many issues related to mathematics and the theory of automata, in particular serial automata. So thank you very much. Indeed, during your lecture, you have once again proved how much everything around us can be described by mathematical languages, mathematical apparatus. Moreover, many things in nature are coded by means of iteration and recursion, as you said, so it's very fascinating. Yep. During your lecture, one question arose in my mind. An extremely large number of things in mathematics are described by the Euclidean metric. I wonder what this complexity, these patterns of fractals and other things would look like if one tried to consider everything from extremely different perspectives, so from the perspective of another mathematical metric. For instance, the metric of maximum, the taximetric, the river metric, or others. For some metrics, these patterns would be greatly simplified. For some, they would simply be modified into a different shape. It's a mathematical topological issue, a problem. But this is a question that is basically impossible to answer now. I know, but I wanted to share a thought that came to me while listening to today's lecture. Another thing, it is very difficult to manage complexity in general, while talking about management this time. And this applies to a variety of fields. In architecture and urban planning, in the broader field of city management too, there are many examples of numerous complexity management problems. As a result, it sometimes happens that certain areas of cities or countries are neglected by local governments and so on, and investments are loaded into selected parts of cities and regions of countries. And in my opinion, the key is to think holistically in this case. It was my second thought while talking about complexity. And thank you very much for today's interesting lecture.
Sure. Renee Tom's work might be of interest to you because he was really trying to describe the boundaries of the morphogenetic field, the boundaries of the attractor basins, and so that you could make useful statements about how a given phenomenon was going to behave, that it would stay within that attractor basin, regardless of how turbulent it actually was at the local scale. So when you're dealing with complex systems and emergence of complexity, complex phenomena, they're not always what we would call chaotic. They're not unmanageable in that sense. They're just different than what we thought. They're not, again, going back to Jacobs, they're not two variable problems, and they're not problems that behave uniformly as aggregates. They're problems that have an interrelationship of the parts that can be described and at various scales, just not fully described. You can't predict with absolute certainty what's going to happen, but you can make predictions at various scales that are still very useful. And this is basically what modeling is all about. And modeling is a very important tool in planning, obviously, and in design. Scenario modeling, as it's referred to, I talked about my scenario modeling software that I developed. And what you can do is not only what Renee Tom described, but also what some of the statisticians described, like Bayesian methodology, where you can, in fact, and I think we shouldn't oversimplify the power of statistics, or assume too much about the limitations of statistics, because there are now some very sophisticated statistical methodologies like Bayesian methodology that allow you to increase the accuracy of your prediction, even though you're never going to get to, complete computational reducibility, right? You're never going to absolutely nail where, let's say, is it going to rain in Thursday, the 23rd of July, 24:31, right? You're not going to be able to predict that. But what you could predict with pretty good accuracy is, what is the climate going to be that time of year? And what are going to be the effects of, say, increasing CO2 and CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere in changing the predictive value of that temperature on that day, and whether it's going to rain and so on. So it's all about, I think, quantifying complexity and using numerical and mathematical and algorithmic methods to be able to manage it in a coherent way, and also to allow the self-organization to work for us in ways that we don't even understand. This is the beauty of AI, is that the way the neural networks work, and I don't know if either of you know much about neural networks, but that's another area of, by the way, it's also in the process of modeling, using neural networks to do modeling. And in essence, that's what AI is doing, is it's modeling some problem and trying to learn what the answer might be, or what the resolution might be, or what the desired outcome might be. That we're able to allow the AI process to self-organize and to produce an outcome that we don't even necessarily understand. It's too complex. What's going on in the neural network, and this is certainly true once you get into very complex computational algorithms and so on, is that no human can actually even follow what's going on at that level. So you don't necessarily need to follow it at a human scale. You need to know that the algorithms are doing what you want them to do. You need to know that self-organization is producing what you want it to produce. You need to know that human beings are able to create great cities in doing what you empower them to do. Just as a physician is able to make sure that a human body is able to heal itself through the complex processes of the immune system, which the doctor doesn't need to know, oh, your T cells are doing exactly this and they're doing exactly that, and they're moving there. It's not necessary. You don't need to manage it at that level. You need to manage it at some other level. So I think there are ways to manage complexity that are very effective, actually, and very powerful, very important. And a lot of it has to do with empowering the agents to do what the agents will do on their own. That's not exactly a libertarian approach. It's more of a distributed agency approach, I would call it, empowering the distributed agents to in a controlled way. Again, a bit of a combination of the top down and the bottom up. So I've gone over a little bit, but I think I've given you, once again, plenty to think about, and you'll have this recording if you want to review it. And I'll send you some material for the talk. Actually, we're going to do our next talk tomorrow. We're going to step it up a little bit and do 4 this week, and then the final push will be next week. And we're heading to the conclusion of this series before too long. So thanks, everybody, and I will see you tomorrow.
Have a nice day.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good